I can't fix my attention on God as the creator and sustainer of all of our lives, and then be jealous of the things that you have, seduce your wife, or steal from you. I can't join you in acknowledging God as the creator of all things and then speak about you or treat you as though you are somehow less than me. It seems like the most normal thing to assess a person or situation by what we can easily know about them and then make assumptions based on what we can observe. There are divisions in almost every aspect of our lives, and unfortunately, those divisions most often end up dividing us between us and them. So much conflict in the world today exists because of the barriers we erect around ourselves to protect us from people that we see as different than ourselves. We take these perceived differences and then we use them to justify how we treat others. We use them to explain away why some people are just different from us. If we aren't careful, we can set ourselves up as the standard for how everyone else should conduct their lives, how they should think, live, act, how they should understand the world around them. Christians should be especially careful in this regard, but often it is Christians who draw a sharp divide between us and the world and then seek to compel the world around us to conform to our worldview. God created the world with this rich and incredible diversity. He created each human being to be unique. Even if sin had never entered the world, there would still have been an incredible diversity within humanity. It's what God intended. Sin has had its way with us, and through the diversity of thought, demeanor, looks, and expression that God designed to be a blessing, it has been turned into a curse. Sin has caused us to take what God intended for our good and to make it evil. Last week we looked at how God designed the Sabbath to be an element of disruption that resists the world's influence on us. A way that we can break from the constant compulsion to be dissatisfied with our lives. A way to stop and appreciate all that God has done for us and to foster contentment with what we have. But today I want to explore with you how the Sabbath reorients our relationships with everyone around us. We saw last week how the Sabbath stood in contradiction to the culture of Egypt and the authority of Pharaoh. In a society that is consumed by the accumulation of possessions, the Sabbath reframes our understanding of what we think our needs are and how we should seek to have those needs met. The Egyptians were so consumed with increasing their wealth that they began to commoditize everything around them. Everything was simply a means to an end. Eventually, even people began to be seen simply as a resource for the accumulation of more wealth. When we allow greed and excess to dominate our society, they inevitably lead to the devaluing of those who we perceive to be different from us. We begin to draw distinctions between ourselves and others, and once we've isolated someone as the other, we're inclined to dehumanize them, to devalue them. We can see them as being deserving of segregation from us. This is what happened to the Israelites in Egypt. They were the others. And as a result, in the minds of the Egyptians, they did not deserve to be treated in the same way as the citizens of their country. They were immigrants. They were squatting in Egypt. Somewhere along the 400 years of time that the Israelites were in Egypt, they undoubtedly came to be seen as moochers, dead weight. And so since they didn't belong there in the first place, there was no reason to not just make them earn their keep. The Sabbath was given at creation, and while its significance is ever expanding throughout Scripture, creation is its genesis. Creation is the fundamental imagery associated with Sabbath. The beauty of Sabbath as a reminder of creation draws our minds back to the truth that nothing that I possess was created by me. I may have worked for it, but the raw materials were created by God and provided for me. My existence, on the whole, is a gift from a God who loves me and created me. Sabbath understood well, reminds me that all that I have is a gift from God and points me to the truth that I am no more deserving of any of it than anyone else. And it reminds me that it was God who created all of us as unique individuals. It was God who loaded in our DNA the genetic material that has led to the incredible diversity in the human race today. And while sin has degraded much of what God intended humanity to be, Sabbath reminds us that we are just one of God's many beautiful created beings. Let's look again at the Sabbath commandment together and see today how the Sabbath can call us back to an appreciation of the great differences between every person He created. Let's look again at the commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Notice that the Sabbath commandment is not focused solely on me. The commandment is unique in many ways, but one way in particular is that it's communal in its scope. The Sabbath, it joins us together. It calls me to make the switch from focusing on what's best for me and to begin to take on the attributes of God, to begin to demonstrate in my life that same grace that I have received from God to others. To offer to others what I have, to give rather than to take. The first 3 commandments are about who God is and what He expects in return. Don't worship other gods, don't make or worship idols, don't take His name in vain. The last 6 commandments, though, they focus specifically on my actions in relationship to other people. Honor your father and mother. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't covet. I can keep the first 3 commandments by my actions alone towards God. And likewise, I can keep the last 6 commandments simply by my actions alone towards others. I don't have to involve myself with other people to keep these 9 commandments. In fact, it would actually be exponentially easier to keep them if I was isolated, if I didn't let others in. The smaller my circle, the easier it would be to obey them. It's interesting that the more orthodox a Jewish community is, the more insular and isolationist they are. The Sabbath calls us back from that human proclivity to separate ourselves from others, to draw distinctions between us and them. We are called to rest, but not alone. When I Sabbath, I am to give Sabbath to those around me as well. Sabbath it's a full stop in my life. I rest, but my rest should not impose on the rest of others. So we're called to be inclusive in our Sabbath observance. Our family is included. Those who serve us are to be included. All the machinations that we utilize to provide for ourselves are to be given rest. For the Israelites, that meant that their animals rested. And I'll admit that this one does become somewhat trickier in our modern context. To what extent should we give rest to those who serve, and who does that include? It's these types of questions that so often encumber the gift of Sabbath with the bitterness of legalism. Now, we're going to talk more about Sabbath observance another time. So for now, let's just leave that here and keep moving. Finally, we're called to give rest to the foreigners who are around us. Everyone is entitled to the same rest that God has called you to. Sabbath resists the natural inclinations of our sin-distorted hearts to distinguish between others and ourselves. If you've ever interacted with or heard stories about Orthodox Jewish communities, you'll find some unusual efforts are made to observe the Sabbath. But one thing that seems to be missing from quite a lot of the examples I've come across is a concern for foreigners, for people who are not members of the group. Some Jews actually hire Gentiles to hang out in their houses on the Sabbath to do the things that they can't do, like turn on the lights, open doors, heat up food, or walk their dogs. It's been noted by some that the Sabbath was the defining characteristic of Israel. It was Sabbath observance that clearly drew a distinction between them and the surrounding pagan nations. It can be easy to fixate on the thing that we assume makes us different from someone else, to see it as a wall, as a dividing line. Our world, it thrives on binary distinction. We want easy A or B choices on how we're going to process things, even how we're going to process people. Our world has been divided on what we would assert are easily distinguishable differences. We then make wholesale assumptions about people based on these distinctions. Things like religion, politics, race, ethnicity, gender, or age. There's a pervading, almost unconscious belief that we can know most, if not everything we need to know about a person based on one simple distinction. And I didn't misspeak there when I said unconscious. If I were to ask any of you listening to this, you would say that you don't judge people on their race, gender, or politics. And I believe you. I believe that we all think that we don't do that, and maybe we don't. But anytime we make a statement like, oh, well, they're just a liberal, or you know how people from Texas are, you're doing just that. You're making a blanket statement about another person based on one easily distinguishable characteristic. Sometimes these things are positive, sometimes they're negative. And look, I'm not trying to call any one of you out. I do the same thing. I catch myself doing it all the time. I'm working on it, but I still do it. It would be ridiculous to try to assert that these differences don't exist. They're verifiable facts. For me, I have white skin, I'm American, I'm a male, and I'm a Christian. These are incontrovertible aspects of who I am. And while these things do inform how I see the world, they don't define me. I shouldn't be lumped in with every other man just because I'm a man. As a Christian, I don't want to be lumped in with the Westboro Baptists just because they claim Christianity also. I share nothing in common with them. Well, except for the fact that I'm an American and they're mostly white men too. So maybe since I'm a white American Christian male, like so many of them, maybe I should just be lumped in with them. I mean, that doesn't seem fair, does it? Why then do we do this to other people? Why should every Democrat be accused of being a socialist who's trying to tear down our country, or every Republican being accused of supporting insurrection and want to tear down our country? Why do we make our differences so unanimous across everyone that's different from us? Why should every person who is not a Christian be viewed as somehow morally inferior to those of us that are Christians? How is it that even within Christianity, within our own denominations, within our own churches, we can be so quick to pass judgment on another person because of the church they attend, or the books that they read, or the clothes that they wear? How is it that we can demand to be judged independently from others who seem to be like us, but still be unconscious to our own propensity to make wholesale judgments about others based on some detail about them? Some people try to make the Sabbath a line in the sand. Throughout Christian history, it has been a divisive issue within the church. People have used it to divide themselves from other believers. They make the Sabbath a wall that differentiates. I would suggest that the true purpose of the Sabbath is not to be a wall, but to be a bridge. When you're traveling into Texas from Oklahoma or vice versa, anywhere along the northern border, from the Panhandle all the way to the eastern corner of the state, you're going to have to cross a bridge over the Red River. When you cross that bridge, you know that you are leaving one state and entering another. But it's not the bridge that differentiates the states. Texas is still Texas. Oklahoma is still okay. The bridge allows us to appreciate what both states have to offer. It's the bridge that actually connects them. The Sabbath is not a wall of division. It's a bridge that brings connection. Within the commandments themselves, the Sabbath is the bridge that connects our obligation to God with our obligation to others. The fourth commandment, it bridges the gap between our faithfulness to God and how that faithfulness is manifested in our lives. The third commandment, it's not a prohibition against the use of certain four-letter words. It's a prohibition against claiming to represent God and then misrepresenting Him. The fourth commandment clarifies to us in its observance who we are to represent God to and how we are to represent Him. It's from the Sabbath command to include others in our rest that we find the natural source of our obligation to observe the next 6 commandments that inform how we are to treat others. I can't fix my attention on God as the creator and sustainer of all of our lives and then be jealous of the things that you have, seduce your wife, or steal from you. I can't join you in acknowledging God as the creator of all things and then speak about you or treat you as though you are somehow less than me. The act of Sabbath, it's a powerful expression of our acknowledgement of who we know God to be and who we desire to be in response. The people of Israel were a people who were highly exclusive. In response to the Torah, they in many ways took an isolationist view of the world around them. They were extremely hesitant to allow an outsider to become one of them, at least in a religious sense. They had a hard time with it, like all of us do, holding this line of being who we are and not being influenced by the world around us. Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they're books that primarily contain rules and regulations. These pertain to what was required to be considered part of the people of God. Break the rules, and in many cases, you were excluded from fellowship with the people. Fellowship with the people also meant that you were denied access to the tabernacle. You were denied access to God. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 1 through 8, we find a list of people who were not to be allowed into the assembly of the Lord. They were people who were clearly distinguished by some characteristic, and they were to be kept separate. And there's 4 separate groups that are mentioned. The first group are men who have had their genitals crushed or removed, otherwise would be known as eunuchs. The next 3 groups are the children of forbidden unions, Ammonites, Moabites, and Egyptians that are more than 3 generations removed from the Exodus. The last 3 groups could basically be summarized as foreigners. So eunuchs and foreigners are not to be allowed into the assembly of God, according to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Understand that from the perspective of the law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, if you are not allowed into the assembly of the Lord, then you are not allowed access to salvation. You can't get your sins into the sanctuary, so then they can't be cleansed. You were essentially hopeless. Now, if we fast forward several hundred years, I want us to listen to what the Lord spoke through the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 56. Thus saith the Lord, keep justice and do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come and my righteousness be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the son of the man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And let not the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than the sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And to the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Did you catch the significance of that passage in relationship to Deuteronomy chapter 23? These people who Moses commanded to be excluded from the assembly of the Lord are welcomed by God into his holy mountain. This passage ended with that famous verse that my house will be a house of prayer for all peoples. And what was the defining characteristic of the eunuchs and the foreigners that were granted access into the house of God? It was the Sabbath. These people who were rejects, barred from membership among the people of Israel, are accepted by God if they observe the Sabbath. Why do you think that is? I would suggest it's because the Sabbath is the weekly manifestation of the grace of God towards us as a hopeless and rejected people. We enter the Sabbath because we are entering into that grace. We are receiving it. God continues to speak here in Isaiah, continuing on for the next couple of chapters actually, discussing the condition of Israel in contrast to these eunuchs and foreigners. And then in Isaiah chapter 58, he begins to describe the transgression of the people. He says there in verse 1, "Cry aloud, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sins." Over the next few verses, he goes on to break down their transgression, saying that their voices have not been heard on high, that their fasts and their festivals are of no value. He then describes the things that they should have been doing instead of the fasts and festivals that they had been offering to the Lord. He says, "Is this not the fast that I chose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see them naked, to cover them and to hide and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard." You see, the people have been trying to merit the favor of the Lord by the religious observances that they thought were the correct things to be doing. They had been endeavoring to display their piety, their zealousness through celebratory worship and through self-abasing fasts. But none of that did any good. God concludes with this statement in Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. "If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall delight in the Lord. And I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." If you don't know who God is, then it's impossible to please him. How can you have faith in someone who you don't truly know? God calls the people to turn back from breaking the Sabbath. But this is not just because they have to keep the Sabbath because he said so. God is not saying, you're pretty terrible. And so listen, if you'll just take one day off and not be terrible, then I'll take care of you. The act of keeping Sabbath, it's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. Notice the things that God said were the fast that he required. They were all about how we treat others. He said that he values it when his people free the oppressed, feed the hungry, and clothe the naked. He tells the people that their worship of him has been rejected, that if they would have their worship accepted, that they need to address the way in which they are treating others, how they are doing justice and demonstrating mercy. These are the things that represent him well. If we would not take his name in vain, if we would show that we truly know who he is, then these are the things we should be doing. And then his solution to this problem is to call them to Sabbath. He doesn't simply say that these are the things that I want you to do, and so go do them. External performance is never the objective of God's work among his people. Never. God says, these are the things that I want you to do. And so to do them, you need to keep the Sabbath. Why? Because in keeping the Sabbath, we acknowledge who it is that we worship and who we want to be as a result. You can't truly keep the Sabbath if you're not being considerate of others, loving them and caring for them. Because that is the natural outflow of truly knowing God and keeping Sabbath. It will restore and increase the intrinsic value that I perceive in others. Sabbath unifies us with the heart of God. And the heart of God goes out to every person he has created. One day, every 6 days, I partake in a special means of grace, much like baptism or communion are acts that connect us to the transformative grace of God. The Sabbath connects us with the grace of God that transforms our hearts. It strips away our propensity towards exclusivism, towards discrimination, towards selfishness. All of these things, they are offensive to the name of God. God who gave himself as a ransom for all. Not just some, but all, everyone. The Sabbath, it bridges the gap between faithfulness to God and love towards others. Throughout the history of the Christian church, people in the name of God have perpetrated horrible atrocities on those that they perceive to be different than themselves, all in the name of being faithful to God. The Sabbath calls us back from this sinful inclination towards shame and persecution. On the Sabbath, barriers are broken down, relationships are strengthened. There's no me and you, there's only us. Everyone is equal in the light of the Sabbath. The Sabbath calls us to celebrate differences that exist between us, and that is something that our world desperately needs right now. The Sabbath is resistance against the inclination to look down on those who are in some way different from us, to fight against our propensity to turn differences into walls of division. The Sabbath demonstrates that we should be building bridges instead. I invite you to join this resistance. I invite you to Sabbath.